Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in another Tuesday essay discussion of Ayn Rand. Today's essay is Kant versus Sullivan and Sullivan. So, James, could you tell us what is the essence of this essay?
Well, it's an essay that was written back in the early 1970s for the Ayn Rand letter by Ayn Rand, and it's reprinted, if anyone wants to read it, in Philosophy Who Needs It. It is a remarkable combination of things. It is Ayn Rand's philosophical review of a play and movie called The Miracle Worker that many people may have seen. It was an Academy Award-winning film back in the 1960s starring Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke. And it tells the story of Helen Keller, who from infancy, because of a disease in infancy, she was both blind and deaf from infancy. And it tells the story of Annie Sullivan, who was her dedicated teacher, who actually got her to learn concepts and learn. She got an amazing college education, which, as Ayn Rand points out, took a lot more, more than a century ago than it does today. And yet she was totally blind and deaf. And it's an epic play telling the struggle of this teacher to get through to how do you conceptually educate a blind and deaf child who basically has had no sight or hearing from early infancy? And yet it's a philosophical review, not so much a literary review. It's a little bit of a literary review, but it's a philosophical review in light of a particular essay by a philosopher that had been published in the academic philosophical press. An extreme philosopher of science who declared that, in effect, science does not need observation, that we can engage in rational scientific endeavors without any need for an empirical basis, whatever, an observation. And of course, Ayn Rand very much disagrees with that, and she uses this as an eloquent demonstration of the relationship between conceptual knowledge and perception.
So, let's start at the beginning of the essay. Could you tell us a bit more about what these basic types of theories that were brewing up in the post-Renaissance philosophy, and what did Rand think of those?
Well, unfortunately, the great problem that has plagued Western philosophy since the ancient Greeks and through the great modern philosophers was the problem of universals, the relationship between our abstractions and the concretes that we observe. And the traditional answers in Western philosophy, going back to Plato, just think of Plato's whole idea. You can't really trust the senses. At best, the senses his whole cave analogy, right? If we're just looking at the senses, we're just looking at shadows on the cave wall. We're not even seeing the outer cave and the true light. That requires logic. That requires conceptual thinking and organizing our concepts in a certain way. And for Plato, these concepts existed in another dimension. We're not perceiving the real world. We're perceiving some illusion, a distorted illusion of the reality, and reality is unperceived. It's only in the form of concepts. So Plato did not believe that observation served much of a role in learning, except to sort of stimulate what he believed were innate ideas about the truth. And it was really only ultimately contemplation of higher mathematics that could ever get us in touch with reality. This idea was, in effect, revived in a different form by the modern rationalists, starting with Descartes in the 1600s. As we've discussed just recently, and maybe you're wrong, in one of our Peikoff essay discussions, we were talking about Descartes' method of doubting everything. He doubted everything he saw. What if everything's a dream? What if everything's a hallucination? What if I'm having a psychotic episode and I'm in a mental hospital? The modern philosophers, what if I'm a brain in a vat somewhere or in one of the Matrix movies or something? And so he started his whole enterprise by doubting everything he saw, and he relied upon logical deduction. logical deduction from certain abstract inferences. And this is what rationalism really was all about. As Ayn Rand points out in her essay for the New Intellectuals, which she quotes at the beginning of this essay, you've got the rationalists on one side who say that knowledge, either it's innate knowledge or it can be acquired by purely conceptual means without really a need for an observational base, an empirical base. The response was philosophers like John Locke, who tried to put together an idea of universals, but not very effectively. He too believed in this veil of perception that Descartes did. And so he undermined the validity of the senses, even as he commenced the idea, a more Aristotelian idea, that to know you've got to look and that all knowledge is based upon observation. Well, that quickly decayed into Berkeley and Hume, who said, well, we're limited to is really perception. Berkeley said, well, to be is to be perceived. How do we know there's a reality? Hume said, well, all we're stuck with are these sensory qualities, all these concepts that we sort of try to derive from sense experience. We can't really derive, like causality, entity, you name it. And so, as she points out, you've got the rationalists on one side who say logic without sense perception, and the empiricists on the other side, who at the end of the day came down to saying observation, but no more than the sensory qualities that we get straight from observation. By the 20th century, there was an aggressive, Ayn Rand's time, there was an aggressive sort of empiricist movement, which was far more aggressive even than Hume. And that was responded to by another form of rationalism. No, we can engage in science, but we don't need observation. And the article that she's referring to here, from the Journal of Philosophy, no less, was by a philosopher of science, Feyerabend, an Austrian who was educated at the university at London School of Economics. He studied under Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science. He was a critic of Karl Popper's by the end of the day. He then came to America, taught at the University of California at Berkeley for many years, and was a leading philosopher of science. The article here is part of his general idea of methodological anarchism. He did not think that the scientific method needed any particular, to follow any particular rules. And so he even argues directly in this particular article that science can be engaged in without observation of any kind, whatever. To know we don't have to look, is what he's arguing. And he argued aggressively and in some pretty bizarre ways that observation is totally unnecessary to the development of conceptual awareness, or much less science.
So could you guide us a bit more on what are the specific arguments of the essay of Feyerabend, the paper of Feyerabend?
Well, he uses, and Ayn Rand, of course, is brilliant when it comes to analyzing the use of someone's language. And he uses some pretty bizarre arguments, and he skips over all the main points, as Ayn Rand points out. At one point, she observes that questions must be loaded up in your head beyond your ability to actually hold them. One of the comparisons that he makes is, well, wait a minute here. Computers don't observe. We just input data into computers, and computers do their thing, and we get output from computers, and behold, look, computers don't observe, and yet computers process information and give us results and conclusions. Maybe one day with AI, we wouldn't need any kind of observation at all. As Ayn Rand points out, well, wait a minute, who made the computers? Who's programming the computers? What's the information that we're putting into the computers? Well, in effect, Feyerabend looks at each step. He looks at the testing. Well, we don't need observation to test things. We don't observation to confirm the result. We don't need observation for that. Any of these steps along the way that he's breaking down, of course, are making vast assumptions, all kinds of stolen concept fallacies, and frankly, is such ludicrously bad logic and writing that I recommend everyone read just this essay. In the first section, it is a ruthless takedown of the verbal nonsense that comes from leading academic philosophers in the 20th century. And Ayn Rand ruthlessly breaks it down to the complete nonsense that it actually is. I hate to be so harsh, but that's exactly how bad it is. And Ayn Rand sends this guy up justly for the ridicule that he deserves.
And as you said, he was very influential, and he still is very influential, despite he died about 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yes. He's still a widely, like Popper and Kuhn, those are the leading philosophers of science of our time. But like them, he's very frequently quoted as one of our leading philosophers of science in the West.
So, where would you place Feyerabend's in the sense of what you said between empiricism and rationalism? Would he be an empiricist or a rationalist?
Well, in one sense, he's bought the whole article here has bought into the basic rationalist premise, as Ayn Rand observes. He thinks that science can be engaged in, that we can have conceptual abstract awareness without any contact, empirical contact with reality, observation of any kind. So, in that sense, that would place him over in the rationalist Plato side very severely. But he takes a step further by conflating method and content. And of course, that is the signature of the what the person Ayn Rand regarded as the most destructive force in the history of philosophy, Immanuel Kant himself, who his whole epistemological career was doing just that, conflating our means of perception with the object of perception. And so, as Ayn Rand so cleverly and accurately points out, this Feyerabend guy is in fact Kant's baby. So he's an extreme example of a post-Kantian thinker approaching. So he's an ultra subjectivist in one sense, but he believe and what he was most famous for in the philosophy of science is that he's a complete anarchist. He doesn't believe that there's any fixed modes or methods of knowing or doing science. And so, in one sense, he's far worse than any rationalist, even though he has the basic rationalist premise that knowledge can be acquired, and that's what he's arguing in this article, can be acquired without any empirical base, whatever.
What surprises me in when I read this review is that Kant was very he tried to make a good argument into why some concepts derive experience, and the way that Feyerabend behaves is really outright and simplistic or oversimplistic in a way that I wasn't able to believe that could be published in a journal.
A
Could you
leading
comment on why?
academic journal, yeah.
But
It is hard
why?
to fathom. It's hard to fathom. It's hard to fathom that in our contemporary times, someone could actually make that point, but it shows what a pathetic state academic philosophy is in. Um, I think that's the bottom line that we have to draw from this. And the power that she uses, the powerful example she uses of Helen Keller and the struggle to get her to understand a single concept could not be gotten into the mind of this poor child that could not see or hear in the normal ways that children have of stimulating their mind to connect concepts with percepts. To the struggle that Annie Sullivan had to just get one concept into the mind of this handicapped child is such a powerful and eloquent demonstration of the exact opposite of what Feyerabend was saying. Yeah.
Given that you already mentioned Helen Keller's example, could you explain to us a bit more on what kind of what kind of imagination mechanism Feyerabend is working on? Like what kind of example he's framing to support his claim that knowledge cannot be done, that knowledge can be done without experience.
One of the great moments of this is where Ayn Rand is discussing that moment when Annie Sullivan has, all poor Helen has really to communicate with, smell and taste aren't much to go on for conceptualization. So all she really has is the sense of touch. And so into her hand, she would, spell letters of a word. And so WATER, with one hand, she's spelling out the word water in one hand, physically, and she's got Helen's other hand in water. Milk, M-I-L-K. And here's what, here's your hand is in, drink some milk, and here's touch it. Milk, flower, dog, you name it. She'd go on and on and on. And at one point, Helen gets the connection. Oh, I get it. It's a game. So water means when I'm touching that. And all it is an association. Well, that's all that the nominalists, and in Feyerabend's case, in his extreme case, that's all he regards sense perception as being. Some kind of signals, vague signals that we can, categorize in any way we want. And there's really no necessary connection. But of course, Helen has not yet grasped the concept water. Helen has not yet grasped the concept milk, although she's got the signal system down pat. And so these modern philosophers have got it all wrong. Words are not just mere labels that we can put on anything we like, or semi-random conveniences that we just put on because it happens to fit our pre-existing models in our head, which you'll often hear from philosophers. No, Helen could learn the signals, but she still didn't have the single concept. And in the play, it's very explicit. Annie Sullivan realizes that she could give all human knowledge, all of human knowledge could be available to Helen Keller if she could only get the real understanding of a single concept through to her. And then everything that's ever been written, the whole of human experience, all of our ideas, all of our history, all of it could be available to her in conceptual form if she could only really get her to learn a single concept. And it is the most extraordinary play in that the climax of the play actually occurs at this moment after all of Annie Sullivan's struggles against the pity of the family that she really has to fight against, struggles against her own doubts about it. And she keeps going and going until the amazing day that occurs when suddenly, and as Ayn Rand points out, only the art of acting can convey the look on the child's face when she finally grasps, no, water means every instance of what, not just this, but every instance of water, and I can use this symbol to mean that and only that. And so she grasps, and the climax, the high point of the resolution of the entire play is when Annie Sullivan says, she knows. She knows. And as Ayn Rand observes, is probably the only play that she's aware of, the only play I'm aware of, that had specifically an epistemological theme. An extraordinary play. And the juxtaposition, it probably was not the intention of the playwright Gibson to make the point against Immanuel Kant or modern philosophy. He probably did not have modern epistemology or philosophy of science on his mind, much less the complex ideas of Kant or Feyerabend on his mind when he wrote this play. On the other hand, without knowing it, he gave an eloquent, concrete demonstration of how conceptual knowledge all rests on observation and cannot exist without it, and has a specific relationship to it, which is, of course, Ayn Rand's greatest achievement in the field of epistemology. Many achievements in the field of epistemology, but they effectively boil down to Ayn Rand's solution to this great question. She resolves the problem of universals that rationalists and empiricists had been confused about, and that Kant had given for Kant, concepts, like time and space, or that's just all the way we perceive things. It's not a feature of reality at all. It's nothing to do with reality in itself. That's just the way we have to perceive things. So Ayn Rand's solution to the problem of universals in her theory of concepts, where she specifically finds and describes the exact nature of the relationship between concretes and our concepts, is the answer to this. And as if a playwright unaware of this issue had written this play could not have teed her up better to explain why that is the central issue in epistemology, and the importance of her own eloquent and powerful solution in you can read in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology.
Just to for completeness and for a bit more of clarity for the person who is maybe coming up to this discussion for the first time, could you at least distinguish more or less what did Kant claim and what is Rand claiming in terms of epistemology, at least?
Well, utterly different. Utterly different. For Kant, our modes of perception and our basic concepts are features of human consciousness. We have to perceive. Now, get this. Like I say, we have to perceive things in terms of time and space. Time and space aren't features of reality. Reality is inaccessible. He totally bought into the veil of perception and went all the way. He totally bought in. He says Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumbers. And Hume had said, yeah, look, ideas like cause and effect, which are the basis of science, ideas like entity, are you can't really get them from sense experience. No amount of sense experience, said Hume, can do that. Well, Kant said that's because they're features of the human mind. They're built into the way, even logic, mind you, if only human beings had to look at things logically. But even logic was a category, you see, that, in effect, of the way, a filter that humans have to look at the world through. It's not that the contradictions don't exist and that A is A in reality. It's that we have to look at things in a logical way. If only, right? Humans are not stuck by logic and can be very illogical. But in Kant's mind, all of that is a feature of consciousness. It's not a feature of reality. Ayn Rand shatters that whole idea. First, she understands that our senses don't blind us. We're not blind because we have eyes. That's our means of perception. And she doesn't confuse a means of perception with the object of perception. Do we have a particular mode of cognition? Will that play a vital role in cognition? Does the specific identity of our consciousness actually play a vital role in cognition? Ayn Rand said yes, and she was really the first philosopher to embrace the identity of consciousness as something that was not a disqualifying feature of consciousness at all. We do have to break down and understand our sense perception conceptually, and that's where the mistakes come from. But she didn't think sense perception was inherently invalid or not of the thing itself. We were perceiving reality, but we're perceiving reality by a certain means and through a certain mode. And but sense perception's automatic. When the real issue is with concepts, because concepts are abstractions, are ideas, are words. The basic way in which we have of processing our information at the human level is all conceptual. What Ayn Rand did was show how universals, how concepts specifically relate to perceptual awareness. And here, it's this very solution, though, that is the answer, you see, that would provide the real way of refuting Kant and Hume. Her answer, of course, is very specific. She believes that at the very perceptual level, what we do is we find things that differ in measurement along the same category. And to unite them into a single unit, a new concept, we omit the measurements. And in this way, an unlimited number of concretes, literally an unlimited number of concretes, can be treated with one concrete, one concept, one word, which achieves a unit economy. So the whole point of universals, concepts, is unit economy. And the relationship is basically a mathematical one, according to Ayn Rand. We find a commensurable characteristic and we simply drop the measurements. Now, that provides the specific answer to the problem of universals, which was the underlying source of all these problems. Did that answer your question?
It does. And maybe there's like a secondary question to this. You mentioned, maybe you didn't completely use these words, but you mentioned something what's called the prior certainty of consciousness. And at the same time, I think this is one of the few essays of Ayn Rand in which she kind of mentions the idea of sensations as axiomatic. Could you more or less contrast these ideas?
The axiomatic nature, well, yeah, for Ayn Rand, the truly self-evident is the immediately perceived, is the directly and immediately perceived. Now that's self-evident. It doesn't interpret its results for us. For example, I put a stick in water, use the classic example. And people who attack the senses will often say, well, look, the part that's in water looks a different size, it looks bent, there's a distortion when you put the straight pencil. Now, I know it was a straight pencil that you put in water, But now in the water, the part that's in water looks different from the part that's out. You see, the senses are invalid. Of course, the exact opposite is true. Our senses are giving us more information. Light travels differently through water than it does through air. If we didn't get that difference, we wouldn't have that difference in reality directly given through perception. It's not a perception problem, because every time you put the pencil in water, it's always going to look that way. It's only going to have that distortion under the same circumstances. It's an automatic causal thing, necessarily valid for that very reason. It's passive, unlike the conceptual level, which takes effort. It only operates by free will. The conceptual mode of consciousness, the distinctly human mode of consciousness, is abstract and conceptual. And to understand the relationship between the two was the great problem of the empiricists, John Locke, Aristotle. Their attempts at this, Aristotle in effect himself even implied that if consciousness had a specific nature, that would be a disqualifying feature to it. And that unfortunately did mark Western philosophy and hold it back. And Locke, with his veil of perception, didn't really believe in the validity of the senses, didn't really believe in the validity of senses at all. So his whole attempt to get a theory of abstraction was doomed from the start, much less not being able to find the specific relationship between concrete and abstraction that Ayn Rand did. And this, of course, was the great confusion that set off the Kantian, you talk about the Copernican revolution, the Kantian disaster, the Kantian train wreck of conflating the contents of our consciousness with the means of our consciousness. As I say, it's everything that we can, all the what's we can say on an abstract level are not what's about the world, but what's about our consciousness, in effect, and a total attack on reason and our ability to know as such. And so neither our conceptual interpretation of sense perception nor sense perception itself, according to Kant, can ever really get us in contact with reality. I don't know if I answered your question there either.
Very much. Yes, thank you. I think it's very interesting because we have touched many times epistemology, and even though we have done one the first chapter on introduction to objectivist epistemology, I think it's interesting to flesh this out into more into the world questions.
Oh yeah. No, this really is the key. Why Ayn Rand focused on the problem of universals is that it was the central problem that had screwed everything else up in Western epistemology. It really did.
So maybe one last question about the essay of Fairbairn, and that is, he has a quote of saying something like, well, yes, sciences are great, experiential sciences are great, but please give us a chance for other kind of non-experiential sciences to be there. What is the motivation?
Rank mysticism. Rank mysticism, wanting to have belief, wanting to have knowledge, claimed knowledge, without the necessary process, the necessary reduction to reality through observation, and in his case, specific methods of even analyzing observation. He was a methodological anarchist, and the only possible reason one could do that is they want to get away with something that reason will not let them get away with. They want the irrational. It's an assault, like with Kant, it's an assault on reason itself. You don't need to have a reduction to reality, a reduction to the observed facts at all. I want to get away with something that is not grounded in observation. Or when it comes to, say, certain scientific methodological rules, he also went that far. He said, I don't want any particular rules about how I need to process the information to acquire this theoretical knowledge, this abstract knowledge. And so what he wants is abstract knowledge totally ungrounded in either observation or logic. He wants to get away with rank mysticism.
Now, let's move to the positive side. And for that, I think Bonnie had mentioned in a super chat, which I think she missed in the sending. She says, I saw a local production of The Miracle Worker, so well done and so moving until just before the final curtain, when the cast joined hands and sang Amazing Grace. Why? I don't know what's Amazing Grace. Sorry.
Amazing Grace is an American spiritual religious hymn, uh, uh, and Amazing Grace. I'm sure you've heard it at some point. It is normally played at Christian funerals, particularly in the United States, and it is a very Christian song about salvation through Christian grace, and how unworthy humans are. I cannot think of a theme, philosophy, or song in particular that would be less appropriate for this play. This play is about the glory of human reason, the power of human reason, how this teacher was able to conceptually train a blind and deaf child, and how this blind and deaf child was able to become a highly educated, university educated woman with opinions about lots of things, opinions Ayn Rand disagreed with, but very complex, abstract opinions from a highly educated woman, even though when before Annie Sullivan could get through to her, at an age when children have a huge vocabulary of words, she was still an animal. Not an animal, a little more than an animal, but less in effect, a frightened creature, because does not yet have the human capacity of conceptual thought trained into her. The play is about the glory of the unique capacity of human beings to know conceptually. It is about the unique power of knowledge, conceptual knowledge, in a human being's life. The idea that human beings are corrupted, besotted, Amazing Grace. How wretched a soul am I, says Amazing Grace, and how sweet the mercy of Jesus is to forgive such a wretch as myself. That is an attack on on humanity, it seems to me, in a profound way. And I agree with Bonnie here enormously. It is extremely thematically inappropriate. It is a contradiction to the basic man glorifying, human glorifying theme of the play, The Miracle Worker.
I mean, that what you say, that she was like sort of an animal. I went to school. I went to many schools when I was a kid, and one of them was Anne Sullivan, and the other one was Helen Keller. So this movie was like going to mass, so it as very often, and I always found Helen Keller to be very obnoxious because she was very badly behaved.
Here she is, this poor child. You can't talk to her.
Yeah.
You can't communicate conceptually with her. Feyerabad says, "Oh well, sure, we can run computers." Helen Keller couldn't use a fork and a napkin. So you have nothing but sympathy at the beginning, because until you could communicate with a human child, you really can't expect them to behave as a human. Human knowledge, human behavior, human decency all rests upon the conceptual faculty, a real conceptual faculty that cannot be developed independent of observation, that requires observation in order to come into being. That simple.
So, I mean, there's another comment for about the movie. Jean says The Miracle Worker of 1962 is wonderful. I can cry just thinking about the scene. Helen Keller actually finally grasps that what Annie Sullivan was teaching.
Oh, it's so moving and powerful. It is one of the most powerful plays ever written. And think about it. The climax is epistemological. The climax comes when the teacher says, and I'm going to cry if I say it, she knows. She knows. And to just get one concept into a child's mind, boom, the dam breaks. Now she can go get a university education and read every book that's ever been written and every idea that any human has ever come up with. It's so powerfully moving.
So you've already mentioned pieces of it, but how exactly does this story reveals how wrong Kant was?
Well, I think we were just touching on it. You can see the state of a human being deprived of concepts. There are other examples of this, and you don't even need this, children raised by animals, children not raised by other human beings, or children raised in a totally nonverbal environment. At a certain age, if you don't learn a language, you probably never will. It's almost impossible to get, the older and older a child gets before they develop the conceptual faculty, the less likely that is they will ever develop much of a conceptual capacity. And so, in effect, what you've got with a blind and deaf girl is an example, sort of like a child raised by wolves or something, only raised actually by civilized, educated parents who had means to hire a private teacher. But both of such examples could not, I mean, in either case, it's clear that the relationship between concepts, we can't get concepts at all. The relationship is one of necessity. Concepts are themselves only a way we have of organizing our sense perception. You can't skip the perception. You can't skip seeing that table, that table, that table, if you're going to come up with the concept table. So how do you do it with Helen Keller, who doesn't see tables? She's got to feel the table. She's got to feel the table. And even some first order concepts probably might need to be explained with other concepts to her, because they can be directly perceived by seers and hearers, but couldn't be perceived except by touch through Helen. So she had a very complex, because it's only through the sense of touch that you could actually get a concept, a word, and then get her to associate it with the concretes that they all unify. Can you think of a more eloquent example of how it demonstrates that human beings are totally cut off conceptually if they don't have the observations? They are animals. They can't use forks and napkins. They literally cannot be trained in any conceptual way whatever if they lack language. All you can really do is sort of train them like you would an animal, through conditioned reflexes or something, through rewards and punishments. And because and you're worse if you're a human, because you don't even have the instincts, that animals do. Animals have much more complex perception. Dogs can smell amazingly, eagles can see so well, and they have different ways of organizing their perception and their consciousness, so that they have tools that human beings don't have. A human being without concepts is helpless. And we can see in the beginning here just the utter helplessness of Helen, and how the only way to really get through, to start a human mind down the path of abstract thinking, conceptual thinking, propositional thinking, logical thinking, all those things that the rationalists say are sufficient in themselves to know without observation. Or worse, Kant, who says that these concepts are necessarily features of our consciousness. They weren't features of Helen's consciousness. Not until she learned her first word from the concrete. These things are not automatic, Mr. Kant. They're not built into our consciousness, not the conceptual stuff, at all, and they cannot be. So I can think of no more eloquent demonstration of, or refutation, in effect, of Kant, and indeed of the premises that led to Kant, going all the way back to Plato.
Sorry, I just came up, just occurred to me that maybe as a devil's advocate, I could say that Kant would agree that you cannot grasp any knowledge in itself about reality as such, that the only thing that is innate in you is the structure by which you perceive things, and that is space and time, particularly in regard to sensations. And Annie had them. Well, wouldn't that
Helen
be
Keller? What's interesting is, of course, Helen Keller experienced space and time. She didn't have the concepts for them, is the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Time elapsed, and she was no doubt at some immediate perceptual level aware that time was elapsing. She had no concept of time. Kant said time's just built into the way, we have this sort of awareness. Oh, time, yeah, yesterday, tomorrow, 3 minutes ago, all that breakdown and stuff. All those distinctions, all those particular measurements, all that understanding of time was simply inaccessible to Helen because she could not conceptually process her experience of the passage of time.
So, um, my last question is, what are the consequences to the world if people are like Fairbairn would be the instructors of Helen Keller?
Well, see, that's Ayn Rand. Whew, one of the most powerful moments in the entire essay is when she describes what different modern philosophers would do to, Helen, what they would do just to show how arbitrary, like your extreme nominalists, just to show how arbitrary our concepts are. You'd spell water out, but then put her hand to a rock, milk, flour, water. See, now you pick, Helen. You pick, Helen, because it's just sort of an arbitrary convention. What do you want it to mean? Can't be like that either. So, and that's just one example. Without having an understanding of the relationship between our abstract theoretical knowledge and the concrete observed facts that we actually perceive directly, no real certainty can be acquired in our abstract knowledge. Our abstract knowledge is no better than the basis on which it is formed. So the consequences would be the utter destruction of human knowledge, license to invent whatever nonsense you want and have it be just as valid as anything else. It would mean the total assault on rational thought, human knowledge, and anything goes mysticism and subjectivism.
Or as Robert says, for the opposite extreme, see the Comprachicos.
Oh, brilliant observation there, Robert. Yeah. Well, we have to discuss that essay. Another one of Ayn Rand's most powerful essays and important essays about the developing human mind. Yeah. Good point, Robert. But I really highly recommend everyone read this essay, Kant versus Sullivan. It is eloquent. It is powerful. It is irrefutable. It's the kind of thing that only Ayn Rand could have written, and you will be moved by it emotionally as well. So please read this. There are some that are like the Comfort Chicos or Apollo 11 for the New Intellectual, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, which are my favorites. This is one of my favorites by Ayn Rand.
It's definitely extremely good. One of the things that surprised me here is that it doesn't end like a usual Ayn Rand essay, like with an upbeat, in the sense that you can change this. Is like, well, take a look at the world. These are the people who are framing the things.
That's it. The people who devise ethical systems, people who devise political systems, people who go into sciences like history or economics, like you and I do, without an appreciation of the necessity for observed fact and correct method and the connection between the two, our endeavors are hopeless. They really are. And what we have is a bunch of policymakers who are going by their feelings or by popular opinion polls. And that's the quick route to hell, isn't it?
Definitely. So those are all the questions that we have. All the super chats have been told. I don't know if you want to say anything else, James.
Well, if you enjoy this kind of programming, if you enjoy what we're doing at the Ayn Rand Center UK, please consider subscribing. During the week, we have Don Watkins communication boot camps. On the weekends, we do workshops on Leonard, we do whole Leonard Peikoff courses, lecture by lecture, week by week. There are all kinds of other benefits that you get. On Fridays, we do essays and speeches by Leonard Peikoff, just as we do essays by Ayn Rand here on Tuesdays. We have Harry Binswanger, who's now a regular feature. I would really highly recommend anyone who supports or appreciates the kind of thing that we do at the Ayn Rand Center UK, hit like, hit subscribe, hit share, and do consider becoming a regular subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK.
And if you don't want to miss any of Ayn Rand Center UK videos, let me make this inception. There's a bell over here, right next to subscribed. If you click on that, you will get a notification when a video is coming up. So don't miss that. Well, thank you very much again for this wonderful type of conversations, James. I think I'll see you next week.
Yes, thank you, Alejandra. Take
Thank you.
care.
You too.